So President Zelenskyy asked us all a really hard question. Where is the security, given what has happened to Ukraine in the last 9 months? Our Minister of National Defense, and I want to thank you again for the contribution that you are making to Canada and more generally to the support that you are providing to Ukraine. But you have said as well, this invasion has shaken the foundations of the international order. It is, as one of our Peace with Women fellows said earlier today at lunch, this is a war of necessity, not a war of choice. And that is a challenge to all of us. So with me today, I have really 4 outstanding panelists that it is my pleasure to welcome. Sitting right next to me is President Alar Klaris of Estonia, who, as we say, lives right in the neighborhood. Next to the president is Senator Jeanne Shaheen, and welcome again, Senator, and thank you, the Senator from New Hampshire. It's just wonderful to have you. Our Minister of National Defense, Anita Anand, that you have all had the chance to meet, and Dolkan Issa, the president of the World Uyghur Congress that is headquartered now in Germany. Let me start with you, President Klaris. You live in the neighborhood. If President Zelenskyy were sitting right there, what would you tell him? Where is the security when our international institutions were paralyzed, when we have China declaring unlimited friendship with Russia, when India is being careful about what it does and whom it supports? How do you answer that cry, where is the security?
You're absolutely right. We are almost neighbors. There is 100 kilometers from our capital to Kiev. It's about 600 miles. And it's 200 kilometers from our capital, Tallinn, to Russia. And I had the opportunity to, as a president, visit Kiev 2 days before actually the war started, and 2 months later. So two different visits. It's an extremely difficult question, to be honest. And this morning, one of the local TV presenters asked me, why am I here at this forum? So I said there are a number of urgent issues to discuss, as Euro-Atlantic security faces the most serious threat since the end of the Cold War, not to say if not since the end of the Second World War. And in Europe, this threat is Russia. And most importantly, this threat is actually a long-term threat, as we heard also from President Zelenskyy, even if it's temporarily weakened by the fighting in Ukraine. But allow me to make to give you a couple of points. And firstly, the outcome of this war in Ukraine has much broader significance for the global security. It will be kind of a litmus test how fiercely we, as a community of democratic nations, are willing to fight for our democratic principles. And will this outcome reinforce the idea that all nations are free to determine the form of government and the international security arrangements? Or will it legitimize the right of the aggressor to deny the existence of another nation on our state at will, and impose this will by using military force, committing genocide and war crimes? And secondly, the outcome of this war also gives a signal to authoritarian states and their leaders. So we really must answer the question, what kind of world do we want to live in?
I'm going to come back to you, but I'm going to go to Senator Shaheen. And let me just set the table here, Senator Shaheen. There were election results in your country that were a stunning surprise without any partisan comment at all. For many, a pleasant surprise. But one of the questions that allied nations ask all the time, will there be continuity of policy? Do you see U.S. policy as the leader of NATO in support of Ukraine? Will that continue without bumps, or do you see any waves along the shore?
Well, for all of us who live in a democracy, we understand that policy may change based on who the current leaders are, and those leaders are determined by the people of the country. I was pleased with the outcome of the elections in the U.S. because so many of those people who were the most extreme were defeated, and that was a good sign. It was a good sign for democracy. But one of the things that I think it's important to remind people is that we continue to have very strong bipartisan support for the policies that the U.S. is engaged in supporting the Ukrainians in this unjust war. I am part of the biggest congressional delegation to this forum since I've been coming here. There are 9 of us, 6 senators, 3 members of the House. It's very bipartisan, and we share the same sentiment that, as President Karras said so well, that this war is about a lot more than whether Ukraine is able to maintain their territorial integrity. That clearly is important, and we all admire the courage and the fight that we've seen from the Ukrainians. But it's also about, again, as President Karras and as Minister Adnan said, it's also about the international world order. And make no mistake, everyone is watching the outcome. And if we want to protect this international world order that we have, that is based on rules that says one dictator shouldn't be able to take over and start a war like we've seen from Putin in Ukraine, then the world has to respond. And so I think the effort that the allies have made, the transatlantic alliance and democracies around the world have made in support of Ukraine is absolutely critical, and we've got to ensure that the Ukrainians win this fight, because it's about what all of us see in the future. If we all want to live in countries where we can determine our own future, then we have to make sure the Ukrainians are able to determine theirs.
Minister Nanan, you've been at the forefront ever since this invasion of building and contributing to the coalition of states that have, in fact, come together to support Ukraine. I'm sure you were struck, as I was, that President Zelenskyy issued that cry, "Where is the security?" after he watched what we would all consider, I think, a dysfunctional meeting of the UN Security Council. As you look out at the next year, and as minister, where will you put your effort? Will it be into renovating institutions that are not performing up to scratch? Or are you going to put your effort and energy in reinforcing the coalition of the like-minded?
Well, I'll just say to start off that, President Zelenskyy continues to inspire and continues to motivate and continues to make us all strive to do better for him, for Ukraine, and for the rules-based international order. And that motivates me every single day. In terms of the priorities, where will we put our energy from a Canadian government perspective? I know my speech was long, but there was a small few few lines in there that were really important in terms of the direction that we need to be heading in, and that is on reconstitution, retention, and recruitment. And the reason I say that, Janice, is that in order for our military to be robust and to execute domestically in cases of forest fires, floods, in cases of emergency like we saw in the COVID-19 pandemic, and in order for our Canadian Armed Forces to be strong abroad in protecting NATO's eastern flank or being ready to train Ukrainian soldiers in England and Ukrainian engineers in Poland, we need to have a robust military. And so the top priority for me is to continue to ensure that the culture change that we have been embarking on continues apace, so that we build a military where everyone who puts on a uniform in service of our country can feel safe, respected, and protected regardless of their race, religion, culture, gender, disability, or other characteristic. That will provide the foundation from a moral and operational standpoint for us to execute and execute well.
I have to say that your statement, Minister, and reflects why we come together as a forum for democracies, because that is, in fact, the description of a military in a democratic society. So that is an important priority. Dolka and Isa, you are looking at Russian aggression from outside the region, in fact, in Asia. But as Minister Anand has said, and as President Karas just said, what is happening in Ukraine has implications far beyond the region. So when you look at the implications of this war for East Asia, but also for minorities and for those who are deprived of democratic rights, any rights at all for that matter, how do you see the consequences?
Well, thank you. And President Zelenskyy saying where is the security? Well, it simply is there is no security anymore. Not because only the Russian war against the Ukraine. No, we have witnessed entire people, entire world, and are very difficult and hard time at the moment. Not only because of the Ukraine war, not only because of the COVID, because also now is the democracy under threatened today, and the climate change and the environment also threatened by the countries, particularly China. China not only and the unlimited friendship of the Russia is behind of the war is a strong support of China. We have seen this, And now is the democracy of Hong Kong is over. It is the all entire world is witness that nothing has been done. Is Hong Kong democracy over? Today is Tibetan people is suffering a lot. Chinese government implement is cultural genocide against the Tibetan people. For the Uyghur people, since 2016, more than 6 years, more than 3 million people, Uyghur, Kazakh, other Turkic people, and the concentration camp, 21st century. 75 years ago, after Holocaust, world leader promised never again. Unfortunately, never again is happening again today. Just whole entire world witness, just silence. Of course, we have seen positive response, entire world, United Nations, United States, or some other European countries is speaking out. But only speaking is not good enough to stop them. So China today not only persecuting Tibet, Uyghur, Hong Kong, also and export, it is repression governance policy to the other country. One Belt, One Road project of the China, Xi Jinping's dream, is a Chinese dream. It is territorial expanding project. So today, non-countries, all neighboring countries, East Asia, Asia Pacific, and not safe, no security.
You're putting a really important issue on the table because I think President Zelensky's question, where is security? We answered it. in the immediate region. But we know that security has expanded beyond the military sphere. And as part of this war, we've seen cyber issues, we've seen food security, we've seen energy securities. And so we've seen the security threats not only deepen, but we've seen them widen. So I'd like to come to all of you just to talk about that briefly. Let me start with you, President Karas. Estonia, President Karas just told me, I thought they were larger, but it's 1.3 million.
Sorry about that.
I thought there were a few more. But it is the most digitized country in the world, which is astonishing. But it is correspondingly vulnerable to cyber disruption and to attacks on its electricity grid. As you live in this dangerous neighborhood now, how do you think about providing security at home in what, again, we were talking about with our Women in Peace Fellowship, in a whole of society understanding of security?
Yes, you are right. We are a digital country, and as you mentioned, can be easily attacked. But we started this defense system already in 2008 when we actually were attacked by Russia. So we had a long tradition of preparing ourselves to defend ourselves. So, and as far as Ukraine is concerned, we also have given assistance to Ukrainians. And as you see, they are extremely good in defending against cyber attacks. And what we do in Estonia, we have already starting from kindergarten, basically, to teach our kids to defend themselves from different attacks. There is also an international competition for young people up to 24 years. That means there is a cyber attack kind of competition where they can defend themselves. So we are training ourselves all the time. And in past, it was attacked to the USA, but now it's everywhere, and 24/7. We are all attacked by Russians. But we even make any political reactions on that anymore because we are not that vulnerable anymore.
So you've made yourself less vulnerable.
Yeah.
Senator Shaheen, same set of issues I know in the United States, but again, the United States plays an extraordinary role in promoting energy security. Along Janet Yellen has led a global initiative. Look out for us over this next year and tell us how you see this broadened security envelope developing over this next year. Energy security, food security, cyber.
Look, I don't think there's a magic solution here. This is about nations that share the same values, like all of us who are here, continuing every day to look at ways that we can address the critical issues that are facing the world. Food security. I can tell you, I'm disappointed actually that Turkey is not represented at the forum. I know that President Erdogan was planning to be here, and certainly I've had my differences with some of Turkey's policies and President Erdogan, but he deserves credit for helping to negotiate the grain deal with Russia. And so I think we've got to look at ways on energy. You know, I spoke out a long time ago against Nord Stream 2 because I thought it made Europe more dependent on Russian energy rather than less dependent. Obviously, many people in Europe didn't agree with that until the war in Ukraine. And now there's a different perspective on energy. We have disagreements in the US about whether we should be all in on alternative sources of energy and wind, solar, or whether we should do more drilling. Well, I think we're probably going to have to do both. And again, I think there isn't a magic solution. What we've got to do is continue to work every day to look at where there are opportunities. And that's why this kind of dialogue is so important. That's why the multilateral institutions that we have are so important. And recognizing the shortcomings of the UN, we are still a whole lot better to have the UN, to have a forum where people can dialogue, where we can look at how we take action, than to not have it. And so I think, again, it's one of the benefits of forums like this, that this is an opportunity for us to talk about how we can work together, what we can do, where we need to strengthen our international institutions, and where they're failing us, and we need to work harder. So hopefully that's going to be the goal of the next couple of days, and we will come out of here feeling like we have some directions in areas that we might not have had coming into this discussion.
I think there's a consensus that there's an agenda of work to be done.
Undoubtedly.
As we respond to this shock. You know, Mr. Nunn, I know that you have increased spending in Canada on that broader security agenda, on cyber, on intelligence capabilities, the whole set of capabilities that are so important to countries in order for their military to perform to their fullest ability. Again, looking forward, what do you think Canada and other allies need to do over this next year so that when we gather in Halifax next November, times will not be getting darker, as you said earlier today?
Well, first and foremost, I would say that we need to continue to support and put faith in multilateral alliances. I think that we are stronger together. And certainly from Canada's standpoint, that means the NATO alliance, that means our Five Eyes partnerships, that means NORAD, and that means recognizing that we need to continue to embark not only on policy making in our own Canadian sphere, such as in terms of growing the Canadian Armed Forces, as I mentioned, but also ensuring that we are unified when these threats are posed to us. Now, to me, the most difficult thing about the Zelensky's question, where's the security, is that the term security is somewhat complex. It's like the term democracy or liberalism. Those are extremely complex terms, and they need to be applied in the given situation in which they arise. And so when we talk about security, we need more. We need more information. Where, what, and how can we band together as multilateral allies to find the solution? The one area, Janice, that I thought you could also mention in your question, in addition to the importance of cyber and energy and military and environmental security, all of which are important, is economic security writ large. We are seeing China and Russia trying to make gains in industries that are not traditionally held by those countries, and in particular China, seeking to gain toeholds in Canadian companies, especially in our critical minerals sector. So it's extremely important for us to be aware that when we're talking about our national security, we are taking into account our economic security and our ability to maintain a national control in those firms. In my last life, as mentioned, I was a corporate and securities law professor. And takeover bid law in our country is provincially run. And so it is left to the federal government from a defense perspective to say, at the end of the day, when provincial securities regulators make their decisions about securities transactions, for example, in the critical mineral sectors that they're permitting to go forward, do we have a federal government lens that we can put on to protect our critical minerals sector? And recently, François-Philippe Champagne announced that 3 Chinese divestments would have to occur in 3 Canadian companies. And so I just want us to recognize that we are in an era where we're not just talking about military threats. As you suggest in your question, it's cyber, it's environment, it's military, but it is also a broader economic threat that we all must be aligned and aware to.
That's a really important, addition to that list. Economic security and Canada, as Minister Anand just said, just recently announced that we will have a national economic security lens, which is a shift, I think, that comes directly in response to what has happened both in Ukraine and in the Indo-Pacific. So that speaks to the broadening. Let me add one more item to the list. Dolkan, I come to you, which is everyone has talked about the form of democracies and how important rights are as part of the evolving security agenda. You represent a community in China that, as you say, has been imprisoned, deprived of its language, deprived of its rights. Can you tell us two concrete things that this form of democracies could do to support communities like yours that face these challenges?
Well, democracy must be protected. Unfortunately, we have seen now the world is voice of democracy is weak, and the voice of the authoritarian country is more loudly, because China is leads that. We have seen the United Nations, some other international platform. China uses economic power to try to manipulate a lot of countries, particularly African countries, Muslim countries. So I already told last 6 years, and the concentration camp ongoing, and the genocide ongoing against the Uyghurs, but democratic countries in the United Nations, last section is 50 countries signed joint statement, stop ongoing genocide, ongoing atrocity against Uyghurs, but more than 66 countries support China, even today, despite of the High Commissioner of Human Rights report published, and another more than 100 countries continue silence, because China really occupied all this country. So that's why democracy is just a slogan at the moment. It must be protected. So most of them now we have witnessed more than nearly 1 year is Ukraine war, Russia war against Ukraine, and now is the country is set up a coalition and trying to stop this war. But problem is we have to prevent, not stop. Is dangerous is coming, and it is not good enough. It is difficult to stop this dangerous. So before coming to the dangerous, should the country, democratic nation, unfortunately time to time we have seen is split voice, not coming same voice, particularly against China, So that's why it's a problem. And now is a democratic nation at least coming to same voice, united. It is very important.
I think you're making such an important point. And if we look at the numbers that you just reported to us, it's frankly concerning, right? That you have 50 countries that sign the resolution in support. You have 100 that are silent, which is remarkable. And I know, Minister Anand, you have been talking about this as well. And that's part of what all of us see when we look out at a world now that is very different. Senator Shaheen, when you look out and think about the Indo-Pacific, the U.S. government issued an Indo-Pacific strategy. Our government is in the process right now, as Minister Anand said, of issuing a strategy. How do you see the international order evolving in that part of the world, which is a hinge part of the world, frankly?
Well, I think it's not the only part of the world that is fragile and subject to Chinese influence. If we look at Africa and if we look at Latin America, certainly the influence that China has on both of those continents is significant. And we need to come up with a strategy in the Western world for how we're going to counter that. It's a debate that we have in the United States Congress on a regular basis, because it is an economic threat. as you pointed out, Minister. It's also a military threat. If we're not willing, I had a really interesting conversation with a previous Prime Minister of Greece about one of their ports that they were trying to develop. And he said, we were complaining because they were taking money from China. And we said, well, why did you do that? He said, well, I came to the United States and you wouldn't give me any money. I went to Europe, they wouldn't give me any money. So I went to China, and China offered. So, you know, it was in our interest to do that. Well, we have to figure out, as a Western alliance, as the transatlantic alliance, how we're going to respond to those kinds of situations, because right now we don't have a comprehensive strategy. We're looking, if we look just in the Western Hemisphere, Latin America, Venezuela, you know, the influence of Russia in Venezuela and now China is significant. And we don't have a strategy for how to respond to that. Haiti is erupting into chaos. And we don't have leadership to go in with a force that can help provide stability in Haiti. And I appreciate the concern about not being the police for the rest of the world. It's an issue I hear from my constituents. But I tell them the story that I heard from one of the women Ukrainian soldiers that I met with a couple of months ago. And what she said to me was, you know, we are here to ask for weapons so that we can fight the Russians so that you don't have to. And boy, when I say that to my constituents in New Hampshire, I can tell you they understand that. And we've got to think about our strategy, not just on Ukraine. We've got to be looking beyond Ukraine. And the other threats, whether they're in the Indo-Pacific or Africa or Latin America. I mean, on food, for example, right now, we are losing the information war around who's responsible for the food shortages that Africa is experiencing, because Russia has done a better job with their disinformation. And we've got to get better at that. So I think we have a lot of work to do, and it begins with developing a strategy for how we're going to address the expansionism that we're seeing from China in all sorts of ways.
I committed to go to you for questions, and I have exactly 16 seconds before I do that. But I want to do one lightning round, one sentence answers from each of you. And it was Minister Anand that triggered this question as I was listening to you. You said you had an eerie feeling that you were in 1914. And what that really represents is that there is a possibility of escalation. That has been a subtext of so much of this last 9 months, that what we are seeing in Ukraine, that it could spin out of certainly where it could escalate to something much bigger and wider. One sentence answer, that's all, because we're going to the room. President Karras, how worried are you about that?
Well, I would like to go back to 1939, actually. Just give an example. There was a war, actually Soviets attacked Finland. Mm-hmm. So there was a winter war. It lasted 4 months. And after that, when Soviets attacked Finland, they were expelled from the League of Nations. Now we have a war in Ukraine, and Russia is still a member of United Nations Security Council. This is something to think about.
Yes. Senator Shaheen, how worried are you about escalation?
I'm concerned, but I think the most recent incident with the missile in Poland shows the circumspection with which the NATO leaders and those of us who support Ukraine are approaching the potential for escalation, and that's a positive thing.
Minister Anand, you're a little worried.
Well, I'm a worrier. I worry all day and all night. And I've been worried about global conflict since I had my first meeting in the JSAT room at the Department of National Defense in October 2021. But I'll say that I'm also a person that refers to what are the governing documents, what are the rules here. I believe strongly in the governance mechanisms that underpin peace and security. And so, of course, I believe in the Washington Treaty. I believe in Article 4 and Article 5. I believe strongly in the NATO alliance and NORAD as well. And so when I have those fears, I counter them with the ability to think positively and to make consistent gains through our multilateral alliances.
I am getting you're going to forgive me, Dolkan, I'm getting a flashing red light on the screen. You must open this to questions right away. So let me see, and just tell me whom you would like to answer the question. I see a forest of hands here, and is there, let's start over there. Perfect. Yeah, great.
My question is about inevitability of wars in 21st century. I heard a lot about responses to the threats, but not about prevention. And my question is, do you think that the war in Ukraine was possible to prevent? Was there any chance to do it? And if there was, why it failed? There might be various reasons like naive belief in trade as peaceful factor of peace, or the conviction of the aggressor.
That is a very hard and complicated question. Senator, we could spend an hour. Senator Shaheen, how about a minute on that one?
I will give you 30 seconds, because I think as long as we have megalomaniacs and personalities like Vladimir Putin, even Xi Jinping, who now has gotten rid of any mechanism within China which would allow for consultation about decision making, it's going to be very difficult to prevent wars.
Did I see somebody over there on that side of the room? No? Okay. Yes, go ahead. And we'll go over there afterwards.
Andriy Shevchenko, I'm the co-founder of Media Center Ukraine. In Ukraine, aside of all the horrors of the war today, our biggest fear is that the free world will slide back to business as usual with Russia after the victory tomorrow, which means that the war will inevitably return to our children and to our grandchildren. So I would like to get your thoughts on the future. What can and what should we do to make sure that Russia is no longer a threat to the world?
Let me start with President Karas and then go to Minister Nutt.
So I'm trying to answer this. We probably need some kind of long-term strategy for that. And of course, first of all, the strategy should not take fear what happens when Russia is defeated as a starting point. I think it's important. Secondly, it's NATO must implement and move to a modern forward defense posture. And third one, which is, I think it's quite important, we should avoid grey areas in Europe in the future. So this is why we have already so many frozen conflicts in Europe. So we need to avoid grey areas. That means we should discuss about also NATO membership for Ukraine.
There's a whole 2 days based on those 3 sentences, right? That you just put on the table, President Karas. Those are, I think we'll come back to this over these next 2 days. Minister Anand, how do we assure that Russia is not a threat in the future to Ukraine, to the Baltics, to its neighbors? What can NATO do?
If we look at history, we would see that it is likely not possible to curtail the Russian philosophy, quite a part of the leadership of Vladimir Putin, that is based on the need for continual geographical enlargement. In other words, the taking of territory for the conception of itself as a great power. And I don't believe that that is something that we can simply, as Western countries, eradicate. That is ingrained in the Russian philosophy, expansionism from a geographical perspective. And so the question in my mind has to become, how do we as Western democracies respond to that threat? And we've seen that in the First World War, the Second World War, and we're seeing it again. And I think we need to learn from history. We actually need to accept that we were complacent at the end of the Cold War when the Berlin Wall came down. And we were complacent when we saw glasnost and perestroika. We should have, as allies, continued to expect that Russia would continue to seek to rise. And I think what this conflict is teaching us in so many harsh and brutal ways when we see the war crimes that are being committed is that we need never to forget what has occurred.
Accountability.
There's a question over there. Can you see? Is there microphone? Great.
Hi, Mataja Kamiya, Professor of International Relations at National Defense Academy of Japan. My question, first of all, I strongly agree with panelists that we need a united efforts by liberal democracies to protect democracy and protect liberal rules-based international order. But I believe that that is not sufficient, because in this world, we have to face the reality that many countries are not liberal, not democratic. And we are now competing with autocratic countries like China and Russia. Which side will be able to attract those countries to which side? And we need to attract those countries to our side, liberal democracy side. What can we do?
Senator Shaheen, what can we do?
Well, I think the upside of the question about war is that the way we encourage stability isn't just through institutions, through multilateral institutions. It's also through ensuring that the people who live in countries have opportunities to send their kids to school, to have a job and provide for their families. They need to be able to see the fruits of the government and of democracy. I remember listening to Angela Merkel, who was talking about the challenges of trade and how at the beginning of the rise of nationalism across Europe, and talking about the fact that as leaders, we had not done enough to help people understand what was happening as the result of international trade, of people who were being displaced, and of addressing the very real grievances that they have. And so in order to attract countries to democracy, to our side, we have to help them and help the people of those countries understand what the benefits are. I mean, it's the conversation we have around elections in the United States, because we have to show that I have to show my constituents that if you elect me and if you come out and vote and participate in the process, your life is going to be better. And that's part of what we have to do to help combat and prevent wars, is people have to see there's a better life, and they have to see that they're going to be better in a democracy than they are going to be under authoritarianism. And right now, the example of Ukraine is a stark example of what it means to live under a dictatorship and a dictator like Vladimir Putin.
So I want to thank all four of our panelists for a really rich discussion. What this panel leaves me with is, of course, the military and the financial support that we are providing to Ukraine is absolutely essential, but that is the beginning of this story, and the very beginning of it. And at the root, and that's why we come together in Halifax as a form of democracies, at the root of this is the importance of allowing citizens to trust their governments, that they will deliver for their citizens, that governments can execute on behalf of their citizens, and that trust relationship between citizens and governments, which is frayed as a result of a very challenging 20 years, and Peter started with that argument that is without restoring that relationship at home, we are not going to succeed as a multilateral alliance abroad. So thank you so much, President Carrot, Senator Shaheen, Minister Anand, and Dolkan Issa, for the contribution you made this afternoon.
Thank you, guys.
Please join us for coffee and exhibits in the foyer. The program will resume promptly.